It's funny that, sort of often there is a stereotype about drinking a lot of alcohol, especially vodka. But I think that while it is certainly true that vodka is a very important part of sociability, it would be a mistake to kind of think of that as a crucial national characteristic. Well, my arguments in historical terms are that national identity is not something that you're necessarily born into. It's something that a society makes around itself. And so what we see over time is that sort of Russians have chosen particular pieces of the characteristics in national history to emphasize at certain times. I don't really sort of like the idea of stereotyping any people, right? There's a huge variety. If you think about the number of people who live in the Russian Federation, one has to keep in mind that it's a multi-ethnic state. And, there are certainly, sort of Russians and people of other Slavic nationalities, but there are other kinds of people, the Tatars, and right now in Tatarstan, which is part of the Federation, of course, there are people in the Caucasus and the difficulties that they had with the Chechen War. So this is the Russian Federation is a very broad place with lots of different people, and it's hard to make stereotypes about them. In terms of the Russians, I think their national myths do have a lot to do with war. And there's a really wonderful book by Greg Carlton that talks about the relationship between war and Russian national identity. And this is not necessarily so much how they are as people, but the stories that they tell themselves. All nations have narratives that, sort of national myths or national histories, and they tell themselves stories about, who they are. And it is certainly true that in those stories that the Russians tell themselves, being, sort of either being invaded and fighting back the invaders or being victorious in battles is a very important part of that story. So in that sense, there is a tendency to think of them in terms of the, sort of militancy. But I think it isn't necessarily their nature so much as the way that they shape the narrative about the nation's history.